Good morning and welcome to the webinar, Leveraging Business Processes to Reduce Operational Risk, presented by NEOS. My name is Kyle Alexander and I will be moderating the webinar today. We are recording this webinar and will make the recording available on our website, neosllc.com. This is the second webinar in a series of NEOS-hosted webinars that will address key business problems. During today's webinar, we will hear from three panelists representing a process analyst, operations manager, and risk manager's point of view. We will leave time at the end of the webinar for questions, but please submit any questions you may have in your go-to webinar panel throughout the presentation. Our panelists today include Carla Gregory, who will be representing the process analyst's perspective. Carla has over 25 years experience in the business process management, organization development, and operation efficiency spaces. Patty Kurlansky brings an operations management point of view to the discussion. Patty has retired from a 33-year career that included all aspects of individual life and annuity service management. Jill Vancor represents our risk management perspective, bringing over 24 years experience in accounting and finance for the insurance industry, with proficiency in external audit, internal audit, operations, sourcing, and risk governance. Carla, could you please start us off by defining operational risk?
Sure, thanks, Kyle. We define operational risk pretty simply. It's the risk of loss resulting from inadequate or failed processes, human error, problems with technology, and we include the risk of failure to comply with externally imposed requirements. Since we all came from the insurance industry, we're all very familiar with the issue of compliance and how to best meet that requirements. We differentiate operational risk from risks created by adverse market conditions, consumer or customer behavior, and competitive positioning. When we look at operational risk, we ask and answer a few core questions. We try to answer where the areas of greatest risk are, what controls are in place, where there might be gaps or overlapping controls. We help clients answer what degree of risk is acceptable to them. And then based on an analysis that we do, we talk with them and work with them to figure out what needs to happen so they can achieve that desired degree of risk or risk mitigation. And to do all this, we typically have used a process-based approach, which is what we'll be talking about over the next 45 minutes or so. So a lot of people ask what it means to use a process-based approach. And the way I answer that is any project has to start somewhere. And we like to start by grounding the project in the business processes so that we are able to understand the constraints, the challenges, and where we can find the vulnerabilities leading to risk. We typically use a tool called the process inventory first to help us scope and prioritize. Because when you do any sort of project, scope's always really important. I'm sure everyone's experienced scope creep or places where you've missed something. So we use a process inventory to scope and prioritize. And I think Patty's going to talk more about specifics of how she's seen that used and have used it herself. So I won't go into a lot of details, but essentially, like any business asset, business processes can and should be inventoried so they can be manipulated for business benefit. Once we have a set of processes that are in scope, we collect as much information as we can about the processes, but also the surrounding organization. So we'll look for existing process flows, but also organization charts, job and role descriptions, procedures, policies, approval levels, system diagrams, and then any information the client may have about rules, risks, and controls. We also obviously look at the metrics surrounding the processes and all those other items. A lot of times clients don't have all that, so if there are gaps in that, we can help fill them as much as possible. All of this gets mapped together into something that we've called the process control topology. The topology, like any topology, layers together different elements to give you a holistic view. This layers together process as the fundamental piece, the controls in the process, the technology that supports the process, the data that flows through the process, in the organization that executes it. Once we layer all this together, we start to pinpoint vulnerabilities across that to look at for deeper dives. we don't do deep dives on every step of the process, but we look for those weak points. The vulnerabilities we identify, may or may not be process specific. We start with process, but this is a little bit different from doing a process business redesign, exercise. We're not looking to redesign the process per se. We're looking for those vulnerabilities to risk. So we may identify an approval step as being a likely area of risk, but when we drill down into it, the vulnerability may not be process in nature, but it may be the approval levels, it may be who's approving, and it may be who's approving what. So hopefully that all made sense to everybody. Because of how we construct the process control topology, we see the handoffs not only between organizations, but also among the applications. So we look for controls both for people behavior, human behavior, and technology. Once we've got that likely area of risk, like I said, we drill down looking at all sorts of things: role-based security, automated workflow problems, system edits, issues with job descriptions. We've used this approach for a past client, and interestingly, the process control topology led us to probably 8 or 9 different types of risk. So cultural issues, meaning with the client, with a client that had recently come under regulatory scrutiny, so they didn't have really a risk-aware culture. The word compliance or regulatory compliance wasn't really a part of their mantra yet. So we identified some cultural issues. There were some manual step issues where some important compliance controls were manual, dependent on one person talking to another person to give them the go sign. We found some technology gaps where whole aspects of the process were happening what we called off the grid, and that was automated workflow. So 90% of the process was pretty well controlled by workflow, shipping activities from work queue to work queue, but there was a whole piece of the process that was happening without any of that oversight or guidance. In addition, we found responsibility gaps. So what I mean by that is when a problem did arise, when there was something that fed back from either the client or a regulator, the problem landed in really not the originator's area of responsibility. So the person whose activities had created the problem was not the person that felt the pain of the error. So there were some upstream and downstream responsibility gaps. Interestingly, one of the big vulnerabilities we identified was an organizational issue in that no one had end-to-end view or ownership of the process, excuse me, which led to decision-making issues. So the example in this case, decisions were being made only with the understanding of the person's immediate area of responsibility. So, but no upstream or downstream impact assessment. So because of this, an automated system edit that was in place to control for compliance was identified as an opportunity to streamline the process. So they streamlined it, and the process became faster and easier to complete. But unfortunately, that compliance control was lost and actually did in fact create a compliance issue. The default in the system released information that shouldn't have been released. So all these gaps led to potential operational risk gaps. Specifically, in this particular case, they were compliance related. All in all, we identified around 80 specific risks related to organization, process, technology, and as a result, we put together a 14-initiative 3-year roadmap to mitigate primarily risks associated with technology, but also addressing related issues with who could do what, so roles and authority. So that's what I mean when we say a process-based approach. We look at operational risk, we start with the process as our primary lens, but then we filter down into all the other issues that can contribute to the risk of loss or compliance violations. So I think with that, I know we're going to do questions at the end. With that, I'll turn it over to Patty to talk about her experiences hands-on seeing this in her operations.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here and share my thoughts on the process-centric approach to operations risk management. I know today's business climate challenges the ability of any organization to consistently align people, process, and technology to operate in full compliance with minimal risk. Standard approaches to business process improvement often do not factor compliance concerns into the equation. In the quest for speed to market, efficiency, and cost reduction, compliance controls can be eliminated, creating unforeseen problems, just as Carla just described. And typical operations initiatives don't include compliance, risk management, and audit resources up front as stakeholders in design decisions. The process-centric approach enables an organization to mitigate operational risks. I really think it's the best way to manage an operation. Over a period of about 15 years, I used a very disciplined process-centric approach to develop the requirements and user acceptance criteria for an implementation of a new administrative system in the U.S., to manage the integration of a life annuity acquisition in the U.S., to start up new annuity companies outside of the U.S., and to define and manage the business processes in a life health annuity company in Brazil. I can assure you the process-centric approach works. Once all the documentation is created, it should not sit on the shelf, which is all too common after a business process improvement initiative. It should be used as a management tool on an ongoing basis to respond to any change in the environment and to monitor the controls already in place. The same methodology and documentation can and should be used to respond to new regulations or changes to regulations, develop the support for new products, distributor relationships, and marketing programs, monitor financial compliance and quality control requirements, prepare for internal and regulatory agency audits, conduct business process improvement reviews, coordinate data management and reporting requirements, and integrate organizational changes. You can do all of that with the same documentation through the process-centric approach. Carla mentioned the business process inventory, and it is the first step in a process-centric approach. A core process is the set of tasks that cross organizational lines to produce a significant end product in response to a customer request. It describes what business processes need to happen, not how it's accomplished or who executes the transaction. The process inventory is the complete list of all the business processes at the highest level performed by an organization. So examples in an insurance company would be for a core business process would be set up a new account, commission processing, benefit payments. The process inventory does not get into all of the variations within each process. It's a static document. It's not dynamic. Once it's established, it's pretty easy to keep it up to date and use as a common reference document, a common language. There's many reasons that I like the process-centric approach. The first is customer focus. The process inventory aligns with the chronology of the business. Each process is an end-to-end view from the customer's first contact to the completion of the customer's request. It provides context for all transactions within the process and eliminates an internal task orientation. The next reason I like it is because it's one methodology with many uses. The same approach can be used to address all business drivers requiring a change or response and to monitor the ongoing operation. Using the same core deliverables, terminology, and definitions enables everyone to talk about processes in the same way, regardless of the project function or system. And my third reason for liking this approach is that all levels in the organization are engaged. Resources work as a team and understand the cross-organizational impacts. It eliminates the silo mentality, creates common language across the organization and an understanding of the impact of any action. It minimizes holes and redundancy. It's a top-down, bottom-up approach. Functional leaders set the framework with the business process inventory and by prioritizing the work effort to evaluate those processes. Resources who execute the task and have hands-on accountability help build the process control topology, including the identification of risks and controls. Last but not least, the functional leaders review and sign off on the deliverables, so there's a full loop on the review of the methodology. When I was preparing for the webinar, I took the opportunity to review the NEOS methodology for risk assessments. And I have to tell you, I really like it. NEOS has integrated the process-centric approach with compliance controls. What makes this unique is the focus on linking compliance controls with each step in the process. Compliance, risk management, internal audit are all included at the beginning, not after the fact. They've also developed an efficient alternative to the detailed swim lane multi-branch method of documenting a workflow. I actually love those workflows, but they are very hard to maintain on an ongoing basis. And not everybody can read them as easily as some of us. NEOS has combined a 4-box level diagram with a table to capture key information, including rules and controls about each step in the process. It's an iterative methodology designed to give you tangible deliverables within a reasonable time frame. They can easily scale the initiative to meet the needs of a client. The same methodology can be used to do a complete risk control review of all processes, similar to what the engagement that Carla described in her remarks. Or it can be limited to a review to ensure compliance with a single regulation. And I'm going to give you an example of that. I'm going to use unclaimed funds, also known as a STEET, as an example of how you can use the process control topology for a single regulation. The first step, if it already exists, is you create the business process inventory. Simultaneously, you engage the appropriate resources from legal, compliance, audit, risk management to develop a common definition of the regulation allowing for state variations. Then you kick off your cross-organizational project with the process inventory and the common business definition of the reg. And this group will then brainstorm the touch points in the process inventory. In this example, it would include processes that create unclaimed funds, enable the tracking of the owner, beneficiary of unclaimed funds, produce data that demonstrates an account is not dormant or conversely is dormant, or processes that are specific to the regulation, like the Social Security Death Master File compare. Each process gets a composite rating based on the likelihood of occurrence and the impact of the risk without an appropriate control in place. Very quickly, it becomes clear that some processes don't need to be reviewed at all, and that other processes are hotspots and need to have a thorough review. Examples of hotspots for unclaimed funds in an insurance company might include all forms of money out and suspense, death benefits, annuity payout, tax management for looking at an invalid PIN or Social Security number, return mail, invalid email, and address changes. And last, management reporting, the ability to gather the data required to demonstrate that an account is not dormant, or that efforts have been made to locate the owner beneficiary, and the Social Security Death Master File Compare has been completed. This creates the roadmap for the processes that require a deeper dive. It reflects the priorities defined by the stakeholders and establishes the scope and framework for the project. Next, you would complete the 4-box level diagram for the prioritized processes, drilling down to the risks and controls for each step in the process. This exercise results in tangible actions to be implemented. I think it's a really very workable, manageable approach, and it has worked well for me in the past. At this point, I'm going to hand off the discussion to Jill. And keeping with my one method, many uses bias, I have a question for Jill on: would a process-centric approach work effectively for the management of SOX requirements?
Thank you, Patty. Actually, so I'm representing the financial reporting risk, or SOX-like governance perspective, and we actually use a process approach for our SOX program, and that provides a means to define materiality. So we can look at a process and determine whether or not it should be in scope for our process, and then in turn we assess it from a risk-based perspective and map that to the controls. So absolutely a process perspective is a good place to start. And regarding the SOX documentation versus a process topology, SOX does not have a prescribed format. So we've been able to leverage our SOX process documentation to fit many audiences. So first of all, it puts you on a plane where you're speaking the same language, and sometimes that's difficult from a business process perspective, how that's defined. So you may have an audit universe different than your SOX processes, different than your operational processes, compliance, financial reporting, and et cetera. So to the extent that you can get everyone talking the same language, have a common process inventory that's agreed upon, you can leverage that for multiple audiences, including internally, your internal audits, your SOX program, your compliance program. It'll serve as your policies and procedures, and it'll also aid you in training new employees. Externally, we use this documentation with our external auditors. We've had cause to use them with our state regulators. And interestingly enough, rating agencies are starting to put their attention towards this documentation, and ERM overall more so. So the benefits of process documentation with the identification of controls, I like it that it's not an afterthought. So I think someone else used the example that if you're doing a process redesign and your controls can be lost with streamlining, but for efficiency's sake alone and not understanding the consequences of the control risk. So here it's not an afterthought, it's in your face, and by having it demonstrated as such, when an auditor or an external group comes in, it really demonstrates the management has a control consciousness, and it shows that tone at the top down versus control consciousness. Lastly, it enables a gap analysis by being able to compare current and future state. Last thing I wanted to talk about was living documentation. So ingrained in the annual SOX process, we are able to keep our documentation living in that we send out an annual campaign, ask for folks to make updates, sign off and certify that everything has been reviewed and is current. And I wanted to turn it back to Patty or Carla in how would you incorporate your documentation to make it living, per se.
I'll answer that with one of the ways that you can make it living is by using the same documentation over and over and over again. And that's where I started with Jill's intro here with one methodology, many uses. Once you have done this documentation of your process control topology, it shouldn't go on the shelf and wait for the next business process improvement project, because when that comes along, 9 times out of 10, they will use the old materials as a starting point, but they'll start all over. It's a very, very expensive way to do business. But if you have your living documentation and you use it when at all of the points in time I mentioned, when you have to respond to new regulations, if you have to respond to an organizational change, when you go to do your own internal monitoring of financial compliance and quality control requirements of your own processes by yourself, when you're preparing for internal and regulatory agency audits, if you use it as a tool for day-to-day management of your operation and responding to new changes, or absolutely not necessarily changes, but new things being introduced to your environment, and keep your documentation up incrementally, it's not a big job. It is just adjusting it and confirming that it either works or it needs to have a minor change made to it. So I think the best way to keep the documentation living is to use it the way it has the capacity to be used.
And this is Carla. If I could add to that, I think to make it usable is one of the challenges in the original creation of the document. So I know Patty referred to the 4-box, and it's internal shorthand that we use when we do process documentation. We don't start with the very, very detailed boxes and diamonds and feedback loop sort of mapping. We start with what we call a 4-box, which basically just means the process at the highest level. Any process at the highest level will have anywhere from 2 to 6 boxes, so we picked the average and called it 4. So the more usable and the easier to use, and the less effort it takes to maintain the documentation, the more likely anyone is to use it on an ongoing basis. So part of the process centricity that we think about is how is this going to be supported? How is this going to be used after this initial project? And we try to make it as easy as possible for the organization to maintain it, to keep it going and fresh.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carla, Patty, and Jill. We do have some questions that have come in during the registration process and a few coming in now. I'd like to direct this first question to Jill. How do you make business processes and the relevant area of business own the risk?
So in my organization, how we do that is we have a very decentralized approach to our SOX, or financial reporting risk process. So some organizations may have an internal audit group that completely represents and covers the governance for SOX and does all the testing. And what that tends to do, I think Carla mentioned, they're not feeling the pain. So if you have a decentralized process, you get those business experts involved. You're more able to keep it current. They can assist in the testing and have more information and more management buy-in. So it's not like somebody's coming in and telling you what your process should look like. It's reflecting your internal understanding of risk.
Okay, great. Another question, this might be for you as well, Jill. How much have regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley forced operational risk improvement?
I think it has greatly, because before you may have felt something was happening and it could easily fall through the loops and no one would know. So it forced people to do the business process documentation, stand back, perform a gap analysis. Where are controls missing? What controls need to be created? And then you didn't just assume it was happening. You had to test for its effectiveness and actually see that it was evidenced. Lastly, the identification of deficiencies to see where there is a lack of effectiveness and identify those deficiencies so there can be mitigation and continual improvement.
Okay. This question...
Kyle?
Oh, yes?
Yeah, this is
Carla. Go ahead, Carla.
If I could go back to the first question you asked, Jill, about making the link to the business ownership of risk pretty clear. I think Jill's answer was spot on. The one thing I do want to add to that, though, is in addition to engaging the business, there's also something to be said for measuring the accountability after the fact. So engaging them in the audit, engaging them in the definition of process and risk is really key. But then over time, building in metrics around accountability into either the operational manager's performance, bonus, promotion requirements. A lot of people, when you think about operational risk and how to mitigate it, people think very tactically about what can I do, how many controls can I put in place, and we've talked about that here as well. But there are organizational tactics that can also be used, and that's one of them.
That's actually a tactic we used in my former workplace at the senior level. Compliance and risk management and governance all had clear objectives each year in our annual performance reviews. So I don't believe we had that in the non-executive levels, but we did have it at the executive levels.
Yeah, and people do what they get measured on, basically. Any place you find a spotlight, you're going to see behavior improvements. It's just human nature.
Okay, we've had another question come through, and this one was directed for everyone. Whoever has some input, please add. How does sourcing impact process excellence for insurance? Yes, how does sourcing impact process excellence for insurance?
Well, specifically for financial. Go ahead, Carla.
No, go ahead.
So specifically, this is Jill. For process outsourcing, they have their own set of controls, and they're working on your behalf. So it's not like they're going off and doing your business. You still own that. You still own those risks. So it's important for us, what we do is as part of the negotiation of a contract with an outsourcer is we require that they have a SOC 1 service auditor's report, which would define the controls that are used in the organization, test the controls, and opines on them. So what we do is you can gather that information, get the SOC 1, but you really need to analyze that information, see what the impact is on your service levels that you're receiving from that outsourcer, see if there were exceptions, if there's controls internally to your organization that you're supposed to be performing around the service of the outsourcer, and what the opinion was of the auditors. So you want to take that information and you want to really spend some time and analyze and see what the scope of it is for your organization and what their conclusions are.
And this is in addition to that, you want to look at who's managing the relationship with the sourcers and who owns the process on your side, and what is the relationship with who's managing on their side. I think the metrics and the service level agreements are key. When you have a problem with that, the easiest way usually to resolve it is if there is a pretty good working relationship among the people and clear ownership of that relationship on both sides.
You also would have a very detailed service level agreement that would reflect the culture of your own organization and expectations. and it would be fairly detailed, probably at a transaction level for turnaround time and quality, the normal pieces. But then you, as the owner of the business, you need a really, really good reporting back, particularly on financial transactions and the number of items in premium and surrender suspense, and how quickly they clear them out, and complaint handling, and a full view of the operation, which you should be monitoring on an ongoing basis, not when just a problem arises.
So I think sourcing, Mrs. Carla, can really contribute to process excellence, but again, looking from a risk perspective, because that vendor doesn't always have the same sense of ownership and isn't necessarily always in the same location or time zone, there are all these different avenues that need to be pursued to maintain that process excellence.
Okay, another question that has come in, this can be directed at all panelists, is making as many processes technology-based an ideal way to reduce operational risk?
This is Patty. As an operations manager, making processes technology-based is the goal. We don't always have the opportunity to have everything fully automated. But even when you have, if you were lucky enough to have every single thing in your operation automated, every transaction, every view that you needed, and all of your controls, you still have a challenge in the definition of the controls, because you have to determine whether you want it to be a hard control or a soft control. And I'll give you an example of a soft control that we used a number of years ago. Probably the worst thing that can happen in a customer service organization when you're doing a payout on a policy, it doesn't matter what kind, whether it's a full surrender, partial surrender, death benefit, annuity payout. If you do it on the wrong policy, there's really no good way to recover on that. So we decided that we would put in an edit. Everything was imaged and through workflow, that when the transaction was pulled up by the processor, the first thing that they would get would be a screen to put in the policy number. And the policy number had been indexed down in our where everything was received and imaged in the imaging organization. So the computer would do a compare between the policy number that the person processing the transaction was working on to the policy number that was indexed. If they didn't match, then they would have to initiate research, either to determine that they put it in wrong or the indexing put it in wrong, but we would have a way to determine whether or not we were working on the correct policy. Well, very early on, we had to make it a soft edit, because if, in fact, there was an issue, we needed the people doing the work to be able to correct it. If it was a hard edit, they would have had to get a system analyst involved to release the edit in order to be able to proceed. And very early in our processing, we discovered that it was taking time that the processors didn't understand the need for, because 99 out of 100 times the policy number was correct. And because it was a soft edit, they figured out they could skip the screen. So they skipped the screen. Now the backup control for that was that if you were responsible for an error of that nature, and this is another way to make controls and risk very visible at the lowest level, the processor who created the error had to write it up, explain it, and bring it into the head of the department personally and explain what had happened. And that's actually how we discovered that it wasn't just an individual skipping the screen, that it was a practice. So yes, getting everything automated is the best way, but it still doesn't negate having other controls surrounding that to make sure it's still happening the way you want it to happen.
This is Jill. Go
ahead.
Yes, this is Jill. That's a fascinating story because I was actually did the control review that led to that control, and I never knew the outcome of it and what problems it caused. Yeah, so that's really interesting. So I guess my comments on that is that working towards automation, we want to reduce human error, and we can also reduce the level of testing. But I guess I would put a caution out there that you can't fix a process by simply throwing automation at it, and that can be a very costly undertaking. You really need to have a well-defined process in order to put automation around that. Back to you, Carla.
No, I was actually going to say exactly what you just said, which was automating something for the sake of automating it because you think it will fix it can be very costly, both to create the initial automation, but then when you have to dismantle it or change it because you find out it didn't work the way you thought it would. So having a very well thought out process, having the controls analyzed for the right risks, and then layering in smart automation is actually the best way to get to that vision of having things automated.
Okay, one more question. Actually, we might still have time for two. Here we go. We are currently having a problem in our organization where one person contains most of the information around one of our systems. How can we make sure we don't lose that information when they retire shortly?
This is Jill. When I had a production group within operations, financial control group, what we had done was to take the critical production tasks or controls and define what those are and create a matrix to identify the backups and provide cross-training. But we took a couple different perspectives on this. When defining a backup, we also defined what the proficiency was of that backup, because literally a backup could just be named, and when they're needed, they really can't fill the shoes. They may have done this role before, then they're 100% proficient, or they may have had some training, which is somewhere in between. So you want to define the proficiency level, and then you want to take a prioritization look. One good way to do it, I know in my group, we are responsible for different areas of the company, and we actually switch that up every couple of years so that I have now had exposure to all of the areas within the financial reporting risk process. But this matrix works out really good on keeping an eye on the proficiency level of your backups, with a goal towards having those tasks, those critical tasks, backed up as needed.
Okay, and another question is, what types of human risk might I find in my organization? This one might be slightly towards Carla.
Yeah, so the risk with human risk, there's obviously the most natural one is the human error risk, where in Patty's example, somebody transposes a number, and that creates downstream operational risks if you're not controlling for that. In Patty's example, they're working on the wrong contract to execute a request. I think there's also intentional risk. You have people who either want to perpetrate a fraud or want to create, perhaps for reasons of their own, they want to indulge in some sabotage. So I think you have to look at those sorts of intentional risks. And then over and above processing or the intentional risk, there's risk inherent in how a job is designed or an organization is structured that you may not even think about until it goes into practice, where you've got handoffs or you've created spans of responsibility that either overlap or don't abut close enough. So those are just a few examples of that. I don't know if Patty or Jill want to weigh in on what they've seen from their perspective.
One of the biggest challenges in managing an operation is engaging the staff at all levels to be invested in the process and looking for opportunities to improve processes. So you want them to do that. You want them to be involved and be self-initiating. The downside of that is if they don't have the full context of their actions, they can skip a step or change a process because it seems like a good thing to do, and processes do evolve this way, and it turns out that it's put the company at risk. And one example I have of that was I was doing a review in a sister company looking at their workflows and discovered that in the mail distribution area they had decided it would be more efficient to hold the transactional confirmation statements and match them to the policies that were printed a day or two later. Well, the law required that the transactional confirmation statements be in the mail within 24 hours of the transaction. And in order to save money and to streamline their activity, they were holding them a few days to match them to a policy to put them in the same envelope. Their intention was really, really good. The impact on the company was not so good. So you have to be constantly alert to changes in your process that are well-intentioned but don't have the necessary controls in place.
From a SOX perspective, I would say that staffing risk poses a risk to your financial reporting program, and that's one of the items specifically that we look at when assessing the risk-based approach at a process level. So we have a series of questions that we would ask around staffing in order to calculate the level of risk that goes into your overall process risk, and that would be looking at turnover, because turnover then can lead to errors or lead to decreases in knowledge, your ability to fill those roles once vacant. And also, we had a question earlier about key person dependencies, and that's something that we would want to elicit as a measure of risk.
Okay, this might be one of the last questions we have time for. How does customer service expectations from non-insurers like banks and retail impact operations? I believe this means specific to risk. What type of risk becomes developed out of the specific customer service expectation?
Okay, well, this is Carla. I guess I'll start. So I think that consumers today have very high customer expectations based on their experiences outside of the insurance industry, which I think, Kyle, that's where the question is going, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. And so in striving to meet some of those expectations, whether it's for online self-service or the quickness with which the process can be completed, or the on-demand 24/7 nature of functionality. All of those, I think, create a lot of operational risk for a heavily regulated industry like insurance. And looking at, first of all, what the company's feeling is towards customer experience will be key, and then not necessarily feeling like you have to match what's going on in the industry is also going to be key. You have to, each company has to decide what their philosophy is around customer experience, adapt what the best practices are that will work for them, and then, like we've been saying, document it, figure out what the controls are, and figure out how to roll that out. I guess those would be my initial off-the-cuff thoughts.
I think this loops back for me on why I like the process-centric approach to the management of an operation, because the core processes that you are putting in including in your inventory are the customer view from the point of initiation of their request to the completion of their request. And you can make decisions all the way along, but when you walk in the shoes of the customer, they make the request, and they don't care what you do in between to respond to that request. And today, with the compression of time, if you're a customer and you make a request, you really are looking for at least, if not an immediate response, at least an indication of when you will get a response. And so that helps you build how you want your process executed and how you're going to respond to the customer. I think most everybody will accept that if you tell them it will be 3 days and you do it in 3 days, they'll be just fine with it. But if they go into a black box of, I don't know if they got my request, I don't know what they're doing with my request, and I don't know when I'm going to hear from them about my request, that really becomes the issue. But Carla's correct. Each organization has to develop their own vision of how they want to have their customer experience.
Okay, great. I think that concludes our webinar for today. We just want to thank everybody for attending. If we didn't get a chance to answer your questions, or if you leave the webinar and think of an additional one, please contact us and we'll get you an answer as soon as we can. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.